great to see such a large and obviously diverse and multicultural group. One of the advantages of a large organisation, and we do have over 2,000 staff here, is that you have this constant renewal, constant regeneration of talent in the organisation over time, and has to be the most prized asset that it has. So welcome aboard, everybody, and I hope you have an enjoyable stay for whatever part of your career you choose to invest here in this university in Galway. I have the honour, I suppose, or the duty of talking to you about an electrifying topic, governance. I'm joking, of course. Governance can be somewhat dry, but I'll try and ground it in the fabric and the structures of the university so that you can see the practical dimension of it. Now, the highest authority here in the university is the governing authority. We call it Údarás na hOllscoile. And it's interesting to see how that's described in the Universities Act. The entire university sector in this country is governed by the Universities Act, national legislation. So, all acts and things done by a governing authority are in the name of or on behalf of the university, with the express or implied authority of the governing authority, shall be deemed to have been done by the university. So, for accountability purposes and responsibility purposes, what that really is saying is that the buck stops with the governing authority. So, all the financial management, all the administration, all the executive decision-taking that takes place is very much with the implied authority of the governing authority itself. And that is a very large body in this university. There are 40 members on it. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So, obviously, to run a university, you need an executive management. And the executive management operates on behalf of the governing authority. So it operates through the governing authority, and the governing authority operates through the executive management as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Moving on, how does it all work in principle? What we're really talking about here is the distribution of legitimate authority for corporate decision making. So how is that distributed? It comes out from the governing authority into the university management team, into schools, into colleges, into research institutes, into administrative units, right across the university. It involves checks and balances to safeguard the collective responsibility of Údarás na hOllscoile. In any organisation, its functioning has to be governed by rules, by regulations, by policies, by protocols, by memoranda of understanding, of agreement, and so on. So there's a whole legal and governance underlay in terms of all the actions that take place on behalf of the governing authority itself. Now, clearly, with 5 meetings a year, which is what a governing authority in this university has, a minimum of 5, the day-to-day management and decision-making has to be conferred on or delegated to the executive management of the university. So therefore, you don't have boards of directors in organisations that are very intimately involved in decision-making at various levels throughout the organisation. They have a strategic imperative, that's their role. They have oversight, that's part of their governance remit. And they have a duty to be informed as best they can. But clearly they have to rely on other structures, policies, regulations, and so on. And I mentioned some of those. So there has to be a workable balance between accountability and autonomy. So that quite a lot of staff here, quite a lot of units have quite a degree of autonomy, and that flows directly from the governing authority itself. But in reverse, you do have the accountability responsibility. Okay. Some of the other parts of the university that act on behalf of the governing authority would be the Office of President itself. I mentioned the university management team. The Registrar, Paul O'Doherty, will talk a little bit more about academic council and college committees of the university. We also have, as any private sector or public sector organisation has, an audit committee, particularly strong one, I would submit, here in the university, comprised mainly of external personnel who have quite an experienced background in public sector governance and who've worked at very, very high levels. So they keep us on the straight and narrow. They keep a close eye on how the university is functioning. They have the power to conduct audits on various aspects of the university's operations, its overall functioning. They decide on themes from year to year, from semester to semester, to evaluate and produce reports on. And those reports then are processed all the way to the governing authority. Sometimes it's not understood, and perhaps particularly in a university context, because universities value their autonomy, but when you hear colleagues in universities talking about their autonomy, they're talking about autonomy for the academic community as articulated in the Universities Act. And that's to be expected. You want academics to challenge dominant ideologies. You want them to, as the President mentioned a few moments ago, look beyond the horizon. You want them to innovate in their thinking. You want them to be controversial, and so on and so forth. But, you know, the sector, administratively speaking, is not completely autonomous. There is an interface between universities and what I would say would be the wider pillars of government. So we're talking about the Higher Education Authority, the Controller and Auditor General's Office, the Department of Education and Skills, the Department for Public Expenditure and Reform, the Department of Finance. And that's partly because a significant percentage of our funding is in fact public funding. So the university is answerable to or accountable to that interface. And that's why, for example, from time to time, the President of the day and other colleagues in the management of the university will be invited before DAL committees, will be asked to address those DAL committees on various issues, and at times will actually appear before the Public Accounts Committee. Not an experience that one would look forward to, but that's how public governance and accountability works in our country. Maybe the thing to say there is that if you look at this interface with wider government, there's been greater state control since the Universities Act, there's no doubt about that. And part of the reason for that, I would submit, would be examples that we've seen over the years of fairly spectacular failures in public sector governance. Now, I don't want to go into contemporary details, but you only have to listen to the news at the moment to realise that there have been significant failings, significant lacunae in the efficacy with which public bodies are managed and controlled, and where people who work there are accountable. So, you know, there have been those failures. Looking at the structure, you have a 40-person UDRIS, or board of directors, and they rely in turn on 5 high-level committees that are subsets of the authority itself. So everybody on the governing authority is a member of at least 2 of those committees. Some of them are members of 3. And a lot of the work in terms of processing documentation, refining thinking on policy issues, all of that is carried out by these committees. very studiously, very carefully, very thoroughly, so that when this documentation comes before the governing authority itself, the decision making at that stage is at a macro level. It's at the oversight level. It's at the strategic level. The more administrative, fine-grained work takes place within those committees. So you have finance, you have academic planning and resource, the support services, the Standing and Strategic Planning Committee, and the last one there, which is the newest one, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So those committees process what goes to the governing authority for discussion and consideration, and in turn informs university policy, approval of policies, protocols and so on. Now, the university management team, it's an organic structure. It has and does change over the years. At the moment, it's undergoing quite an amount of change, which is consonant with the fact that we now have a new president not too long in his position. So we have the president, the registrar and deputy president, the bursar, vice president for research, vice president for equality and diversity, chief operations officer, the secretary, academic secretary, director of human resources, and there are 5 executive deans. So that may change again. Certainly there have been recent changes. But that is the group that constitute the senior management or the senior executive of the university. Now, ethical conduct, another slightly nebulous concept, okay? But again, useful to think about this in terms of what's said in the Universities Act. So, UDRIS members are exhorted to or expected to, at all times, act in the best interest of the university. Some of you will be, in time, I'm sure, members of the governing authority, and you're mainly elected to that position. Some are selected, and therefore, you know, there are many constituencies reflected, I won't say represented, but reflected around the governing body table. Now, while you're there, obviously, and mindful of the interests of that constituency that you represent, it could be the professor category, or it could be the minister's nominee category, or it could be cultural organisations category. That representation, if you like, is secondary to the first bullet there. At all times, you're to act in the best interests of the university. So the primary focus is the university's welfare, and all of that is part of the fabric of collective responsibility and accountability. And people need to be acutely aware of conflicts of interest and act accordingly. Now, it's not that there's a diktat around that. All of us are mature adults and we're experienced, and if you're a member of a board of directors and an issue comes up for discussion that you personally might have a conflict in relation to, the primary responsibility is on you to discreetly declare that and do something about it. I'll give you one practical example of it. Let's say you're an academic on the governing authority. You're a lecturer, and there's discussion on a new senior lecturer competition or on the outcome of a competition. That might be something you would see as having or posing a conflict of interest, and you might excuse yourself from the meeting. So ethical conduct is really ethical behaviour. A lot of judgment, sound, common sense judgment comes into it. There is an internal legal framework here in the university. In some ways you might say it's anachronistic. You know, it goes back to 1848 with the establishment of this university. Those statutes, those regulations have national legal effect. They are recognised. They have the imprimatur of the High Court. So part of my job is to write these and they deal with appointment procedures, establishing offices or structures in the university. Professorships, lectureships would be the positions. Then colleges and school structures, and they change from time to time. And then election procedures as well. I'm moving pretty quickly because time is of the essence. Now, what are the broad functions of the governing authority? I mentioned earlier, I started by saying the buck stops there. So what are their broad functions under the Act? To control and administer land, to appoint a chief officer and other employees as it thinks necessary, to draw up what I just mentioned, to appoint such and as many committees consisting either wholly or partly of members of UDRAS as it thinks necessary, have regard for the promotion of the Irish language, which is a unique statutory responsibility that this particular university has, mainly because of its location here on the western seaboard with a huge gatetucked area from Donegal to Kerry. You have to have regard for the attainment of gender balance and equality of opportunity amongst the students and staff, and ensure that the university contributes to the promotion of the economic, cultural and social development of the state. And clearly, for that last one there, it is reliant on the academic community. The chief officer, just to say a word about that onerous role, and it is an extremely onerous role. We have a community of 21,000 people here, over 2,000 staff, annual budget of over 200 million. It's a very complex organisational structure, very large. So to manage and direct university in its academic, administrative, financial, personnel and other activities, he or she is answerable to UDRAS for the efficient and effective management of the university and the performance of his or her functions. They can delegate some of their functions to other employees, and they do in practice. They're entitled to be a member of and preside over any and all meetings in the university if they so desire. They hold office for 10 years. They can be asked, I mentioned that earlier, to account for the performance of the university to committees of both houses of the Oireachtas. They're the national parliament itself and the Senate as well. And to prepare a short report for UDRAS on the operation and performance of the university plan. I will leave it at that. I think I've covered enough ground there. So you can see that, you know, the larger the organisation, you know, the more important it is really to have well-defined governance responsibilities and governance structures that flow from this board of directors throughout the organisation and that infuses it with delegated responsibility and accountability. So it's very much a two-way flow. So that's really what I'll say for now, and I'll hand over, I think, to Paul. I don't know, there may be opportunities for questions later, are there? Yeah.
We'll try.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much.